name is Loren Ludwig. I play the viola da gamba with Acronym. I'm a viola da gamba player and music historian based in Baltimore. I want to talk today a little bit about the viola da gamba in Canada in the 17th and 18th century, and then I'll play a piece. So I want to start with a story. In the 1850s, the nuns in the Hôpital Général in Quebec City called in some masons because they had some sort of leak. And the masons, when they started working on the leak, discovered that the wall on which they were working seemed to be hollow. And when they opened up the wall to find out what was behind it, what was this cavity behind it, they found 10 violas da gamba, musical instruments, from 100 years before that had been walled up by the nuns. It turns out that in the 1750s, the English had besieged Quebec City, and the nuns in the 18th century had been so worried about these beautiful, valuable instruments that they had walled them up to keep them from the British. And then clearly they'd been forgotten, and it was 100 years later that they were discovered in the wall. The instruments that were discovered, at least half of them, about 5 of them, were still restorable and playable. And over the next several decades, those instruments found their way to collectors and to instrument makers and restorers in North America. And today, several of those instruments still survive. There are several in the Met collection in New York City, and there are a couple circulating in collections still in Canada. The story of these nuns discovering these instruments in the 1850s in Quebec City is known from a newspaper article written in the 19-teens and published in Quebec in French. And I got interested in this story when I first read it in a wonderful book by Elisabeth Galland-Morin called Le Vie musicale en Nouvelle-France, written in 2003. It's a wonderful account of the musical history of Nouvelle-France. There's very little corroborating evidence for this story, aside from this newspaper account and the surviving instruments. But there's one mention in this newspaper article that one of these instruments taken from the convent, from the wall, was exhibited at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, where, according to this newspaper article, it won an award for the oldest musical instrument in North America. I started digging around in the archives associated with the Centennial Exhibition to see if I could find any evidence of this account and maybe help corroborate some aspect of this story. And sure enough, in the records from Canada and from the Centennial Exhibition, we see that 2 musical instrument collectors and instrument makers made their way to Philadelphia in 1876 from Quebec City and exhibited an instrument dated from 1712. The amazing thing about this to me is that one of the surviving instruments known today that now lives in Montreal is dated 1712. It's almost certainly the same instrument that was exhibited in Philadelphia in 1876. So various pieces come together to suggest that this discovery of these instruments by the nuns in the 1850s is probably a true story. But there are 2 other mentions of the viola da gamba in Nouvelle-France that I want to talk about briefly. One of them is from several decades before, or more than several decades, at least a century before the instruments were discovered in the Hôpital Général. There's writing by one of the Ursuline nuns associated with the Hôpital, and in it the nun writes that she had been teaching a bunch of children to play the viola da gamba, and that one of them was particularly talented, and her playing was particularly moving and beautiful. And that player, that young girl's name is known. It's Agnes Chabdikushish, and she was a First Nations child. So the first known viola da gamba player in Nouvelle-France is a young First Nations girl, which I think is a wonderful, sort of casts a wonderful vision on this history. The other appearance of violas da gamba in Nouvelle-France that I'll mention is that in the 1720s, Intendant Claude Thomas Dupuis was sent by the French government to be part of the upper echelons of the administration of Nouvelle-France. And Dupuis lasted for about 2 years. He didn't get along with the governor and was eventually sort of sent back to France, somewhat in disgrace. And his estate inventory from his residence in Quebec survives. And in it, we see that he brought with him and had with him while he was in Nouvelle-France 2 English violas da gamba, as well as many books of music. And the books of music include, for example, a whole bunch of operas by Lully. So amazingly, there were a whole bunch of operas by Lully in Quebec in the early 18th century. Amid Dupuis' music collection were several books of music by the wonderful French composer Marin Marais, who was a viola da gamba virtuoso and whose 5 books of viola da gamba music remain sort of one of the touchstones of the repertory. That's many of our favorite music is Marais' solo viola da gamba music. In one of those books was the piece that I'm about to play, Voix Humaines, a beautiful solo in D major for viola da gamba that we know to have been in Nouvelle-France in the early 18th century.